Hi, I'm Peggy Farron. Thanks for joining us on the Understand Photography Show, where we talk about travel, nature, and fine art photography. Today, we're going to be talking about incorporating wildlife into your landscape photography. Hey, did you know that we have a ton of resources on understandphotography.com for photographic artists? If you're looking to sell your artwork, then go to understandphotography.com. You'll see right on the front page, resources for photo artists. Click on that and you will see all the different things that we do to help photographers sell their artwork. We have a lot of free support as well as paid classes, consulting services. On our Instagram, I post something daily, some type of tip on how to sell your photography as fine art. Also on understandphotography.com, there's a lot of free resources for all types of photographers. We teach photography, that's what we do. So check out our website and join our mailing list. You'll see several places on our website to join our mailing list. We send a newsletter out once a month full of photo tips and what's happening within our company. David Swindler is my guest today on the Understand Photography Show. David is a landscape and wildlife photographer based in Utah, and he's an amazing teacher. I got a lot out of this show, and I hope that you do too. He's going to talk about incorporating wildlife into your landscape photography. So welcome, David.
Thank you for having me on. It's such a pleasure for me to be on this podcast.
Awesome. Now give our audience a short bio about you.
Yeah, so I've always been an avid outdoorsman, and I just love spending time in nature. And part of what led me into photography is being able to share my experiences in the outdoors with others, whether that be the amazing wildlife I see or the incredible landscapes I encounter. And, my background was in chemical engineering, and I worked for 10 years as a research engineer for the semiconductor industry. And I decided after 10 years of working there that I wanted to do something more with my life. And that's when I decided to quit my job and go into photography full time. And eventually that led me down the road to start doing guided photography tours and workshops, which is now my full-time occupation. In addition to doing full-time photography workshops through Action Photo Tours, which is my company that's based out of Southern Utah, I also am part of the Outsiders Photography Group, where we put on conferences and events specifically geared towards nature photographers. And so we're really excited about these events that we have coming up, and I'm also really excited to share a few thoughts with you today on our topic.
Okay, yeah, and today we're going to be talking about incorporating wildlife into landscape. So what do you mean by that?
And so when I've worked with people over the years, they always tend to segregate themselves into two camps. Either you're a landscape photographer or you're a wildlife photographer. And most people never say, oh, I want to do both. And one time I took a guy out who was a wildlife photographer, and we had the most amazing light this particular morning. Fog coming in, the light was coming through, the mountain peaks were just coming through the fog. It was like absolutely stunning. And I looked at this guy and I said, don't you want to take a picture of this? This is so awesome. And he says, no, I only want to take pictures of wildlife. And then he found this little pika poking its head out of a rock, and he goes and he photographs that, when I'm just seeing this amazing landscape opportunity all around us. And so when I talk about incorporating wildlife with landscapes, what I'm talking about is how do we merge the best of both worlds? And how do we show wildlife in the context of the greater landscape? And how does that landscape give credibility to the wildlife? And so, what are some of the reasons that people don't want to dabble in both camps? Well, either they're not interested in one or the other, or they don't have the right gear, or they never learned the techniques for one versus the other, or they claim they don't have the eye for it, etc. But what I like to do with the landscape and the wildlife together is that when you shoot like let's say an elk or a bear, and you show the landscape all around it, well, you can't fake that. That's not a shot that's coming from the zoo or from a game farm or from wherever. You're showing the real deal. And you're showing where the animal lives. You're showing the environment around it. You're showing the behavior of that animal, and it really brings the landscape to life.
That sounds good. Yeah. It's funny because I love wildlife, and of course I live in Florida, and the birds are amazing here with
Oh,
every color, everything like that. And I have a lot of pictures of birds if they're standing still.
yeah.
But I'm not a bird photographer, so I haven't really put the time and effort into trying to photograph birds in flight, and so I never say I'm a wildlife photographer because I feel like, I'm not that good at the birds. I mean, other
Yeah.
wildlife doesn't move as quickly, so I do have raccoons and alligators and
Yeah.
things like that, but birds I've never, so I would be like too intimidated to even say that that's who I am.
Uh-huh. And that's the
So I
thing is
get
you don't
that.
need to be intimidated by it. Go out there and just start trying it, start practicing. And you don't have to nail the perfect shot the first time you go out because it's not going to happen. And trying to do birds in flight, that's a very advanced topic, as you know, and capturing the motion and doing all that and getting the focusing right and not clipping the wings. We can go on and on. But what the topic of this presentation is capturing more of the wildlife with the grander landscape. So it's not trying to get that tight cropped in shot of just the animal's portrait. It's trying to get kind of a more of a backed out view where the animal complements the landscape.
All right, well, let's start with like what kind of gear do you, well, just what kind of gear?
Yeah, so when we think wildlife photography, we think of that guy lugging around the huge tripod, the full gimbal head, the giant super telephoto lens, and taking a long time to get all set up and get everything ready to go. But that's not how I like to photograph. I used to have that super telephoto lens, and I found that it was just so big and bulky that I never wanted to take it anywhere. It took way too long to get set up to finally get my shots, and by the time I got everything ready, the animal was long gone. And so with the advent of digital cameras these days, going up a few stops in ISO is not nearly so disadvantageous as it was 5-6 years ago. So the advantage of those huge super telephoto lenses is going to the wayside. And instead, many wildlife photographers now are opting for the hand-holdable zooms that offer far more flexibility. They're easy to store in a backpack. You can whip them out on a moment's notice. You can hike around with them. You can hand hold all day long and not get tired. And so as far as gear goes, probably my favorite lens for this is my 100 to 400 millimeter. It's like
Okay.
the perfect focal length. It's easy to fit in your backpack. It's not so huge that your arms and shoulders are going to get tired when you're hand holding it. And if I need more reach, then I also have a 200 to 600 zoom. And for me, zooms are vital because a lot of times when I'm shooting, I can't back up or go forward either because I might scare away the animal or there's a cliff behind me. And so being able to zoom in and out lets you nail that perfect composition every time.
So what do you say to the people who say, oh, prime lenses are so much sharper?
I say it's kind of a moot point because I used to have a 500 millimeter f4 lens that was one of those $10,000 super telephotos. And the reason I sold it is for the reasons I mentioned before, but also because I checked sharpness on this and compared it to like my 100 to 400 or my 200 to 600, and it was every bit, and the zoom lens was every bit as sharp.
Yeah, I've been a photographer for a really, really long time, and I think it was true 20 years ago that zoom
Mm-hmm.
lenses just weren't as sharp.
Yeah.
But I think
Mm-hmm.
the technology has just is fabulous now. That I almost always use zooms now. It's
Uh-huh.
just easier, like you said. You can, especially if you're shooting wildlife, you can't get closer or get
Yeah,
farther at times.
it takes too long to walk back and forth, and you also, if you're changing lenses all the time, you're going to be contaminating your sensor, and that's going to cause lots of problems with sensor spots, or even worse, getting some kind of a wet contamination on your sensor.
Excellent, excellent point. All right, so are you full frame or crop frame?
I love my full frame because I sometimes do like to push that ISO higher to be able to get sharper shots, in lower light. And now that, my latest camera is the Sony a7R4, which is a 61 megapixel. And if I need to, I can shoot that in crop sensor mode and still get a 28 megapixel image, which is
Oh,
pretty amazing. And so I can have both in one camera body and have the advantages of the full frame sensor.
how much does that camera cost?
I think that was right under $3,000.
Really? That's not
Yeah.
too bad.
Yeah, it's not bad at all, compared to the cost of like a medium format camera. It's
That kind of
certainly
blows my
much
mind.
more affordable.
I thought it would be more. And so do you use a tripod?
It depends. There's times when I have used it, but many times when I'm chasing wildlife, not chasing as in the, um, no, I'm not running the animal down and scaring it or anything. Just when I'm trying to line it up for a shot and stuff. The tripod I find tends to slow me down too much and kind of get in the way. And I would much rather get the shot at a little bit higher ISO than miss the shot entirely because I'm fiddling with the tripod.
Okay.
Now, there are times when I do use the tripod, like, I've gotten really cool shots of bears fishing in a stream and doing a long exposure to kind of smooth out the water effect, or like bighorn sheep that are posing in front of a full moon, and they're holding still enough that I can kind of use that tripod to slow things down. And so, there are certain situations where it's certainly called for. But there's other times when just getting the shot matters way more, and you just got to be mobile and you got to be quick. And so being able to handhold is the advantage there.
Okay. All right. So how do we find, is there anything else about gear that I'm missing?
And yeah, so the other thing about gear is just having a camera that's going to have a faster frame rate.
Okay.
And so you don't want one that's just going to shoot 2 or 3 frames per second. I'd say you want something at least 4 to 5 frames per second, or more ideally 8 to 10 frames per second. Because that way, when you have a motion sequence, you're able to fire off a bunch of frames and be able to get that perfect pose, when the elk sticks its head up and you see the antlers above the horizon, or, when the bear dives into the river to catch that fish. You're going to want to have multiple frames at your disposal.
Okay. Okay. Good.
And then also make sure it's fast enough too, so that, if there's a buffer lag, when it's trying to write to that card, that you're not going to be unable to shoot because it's trying to record the previous information.
Oh, so you need fast cards as well as.
Yeah, fast cards and a fast buffer speed is ideal. And then, of course, having a camera body with good autofocus and different autofocus modes will pay dividends. Because you're going to be shooting a lot in the continuous or the servo autofocus modes.
Okay.
And being able to switch to different types of modes, will help out quite a bit. That's one reason I like the Sony mirrorless, is they have a lot of AI built into the camera, where it can kind of you kind of define what your subject is, and then the AI can kind of follow that subject and continually focus on that subject. And that's something that they just couldn't do with DSLRs, where you're looking through a viewfinder. Now that everything's kind of going digital, they're able to incorporate a lot more AI technology, and it makes things so much easier.
Yeah. Yeah. And so with the servo mode on the Sony, I'm not familiar with that, so I'm going to go just ask you a couple. Do you have more than one focus mode, or I don't understand?
Oh yeah, you have probably like 20 different focus modes where you can tell it. Yeah, you can say, oh, I want to do just the wide focus mode and have it pick whatever points it thinks is relevant throughout the entire frame. Or I can define it to a specific zone, like center or right side or left side. or I can specify a flexible spot, whether it be large, medium, or small, and I can move that spot around. Or I can have it do a lock-on focus where I define kind of a subject and then it locks onto that and tries to follow it through the frame.
And
And
how
so
easy
there's,
to change? Is it fast to change? Like
yeah.
you see, I don't know, what kind of wildlife do you have out there? Buffalo? I don't
Well,
know.
we have all kinds of stuff, you know.
But you see
But yeah,
something running and you're like, oh, I really want to be in the zone over to the left. I mean, how fast is it to change?
it's actually really fast. There's just a little joystick on the back of the camera, and I can adjust that while I'm still looking through the viewfinder.
Nice.
And then I also use back button focus, which is a really big advantage, even for landscape shooting alone. You know, once you go to back button focus, you'll never want to go back to shutter button focus. And so that way with back button focus, you know, I can even focus and recompose as needed without the focus changing on me in fast moving situations.
Okay. Okay.
And so, and the other thing too is, you know, you just want to practice with your camera a lot before you go out. You know, you don't want to be missing shots because you're having a camera issue. And trust me, it's happened to me. It's happened to most of us out in the field. You know, one time I was up in the Arctic and there was this huge herd of caribou that was migrating over the pass through the snow. And, you know, I kind of found this rock I could go and hide behind. And I went and, you know, I grabbed my camera and I went behind this rock and I got myself positioned in front of the herd. And then all of a sudden the caribou starts coming running by just right by me. And it was like incredible. And I get out my camera to start shooting, only to realize that my card was full.
Oh.
And I didn't have my backpack with me, so I couldn't just swap out my card. And this is before the day when most cameras came standard with dual SD card slots, so I didn't have an extra card in the camera. And so I'm trying to quickly delete old shots I didn't like and try to take some new ones, and here I am missing the best shots.
Oh.
And this is one of the most incredible opportunities I had. And so, you know, you learn from those mistakes and you learn to make sure that you know how to operate your camera quickly, that everything's in order, that you have a full battery, that you have plenty of room on that card, that you have a spare card with you or in your secondary slot. You know, just little things like that make all the difference. The other thing I teach people is that you have custom modes on most of these cameras, and you want to set up one or two of those custom modes for settings that you're going to use often for things like wildlife. Because when something does happen, it can take a long time to get all your settings changed around from a landscape mode into a wildlife mode.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, if you can just do a quick turn of the dial to one of your custom modes, it's going to save you a lot of time.
That's really good advice too. You know, when I have SanDisk sent these, or not sent these, but they came with the SanDisk SD cards for a while, and then everybody knew that I liked them, so I got a lot of from my friends. But it's a tiny little wallet that just attaches to my strap, so I keep some of my extra SD cards in, so they're right on the strap. So
yeah, well, that's a really good idea too.
Well, my story is scarier than yours. I did this wedding, and it was the most expensive wedding I had ever done. I mean, I didn't make this kind of money, but they spent over $500,000 was their budget for this wedding. And they had us park in the employee parking lot, which didn't have any lights. So after the wedding, I had 3 photographers, you know, it was a big deal. After the wedding, I put everything in my car and I went home, and I always back everything up the same night just in case. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning and I'm loading all those cards in. And then I realized, and I loaded the ones that were on the straps, but the main big wallet I had, I realized it was missing.
Oh no.
And it was just a stroke of luck that one of my assistants' husband worked at that country club. So they went over there at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning with flashlights, and they found it. It just fell when I was putting my stuff away.
Oh,
God,
oh
thank you,
man.
God, because that guy, and you know, that customer ended up being a really good customer, but I don't think he would have been.
Oh man, that could have been disastrous.
Oh, geez. And I had the little thing on my strap, but I had three
Hmm.
photographers and we were there for 12 hours. So, that was so many of them.
Oh
And that was
man.
before we had the big cards, the big
Hmm.
cards, the 64 gigabit cards, they didn't even make those back then. So we were still of the mindset where we had just flipped from film. So
Hmm.
we like to use a lot of cards just in case one of them went corrupt.
Hmm.
So, I was only getting 100 shots per card. So I had a million cards. So, oh, yeah, yeah. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Just be sure you have all your backup equipment with you at all times, right?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So let's talk about location. You were hiding behind a rock for this situation. I mean, how do you scout? How do you, and how much of the landscape are you putting in? Well, no, talk about how to find the location first.
Yeah, so as they say in real estate, location, location, location. The same holds true with wildlife photography. And I've found this out, through plenty of experience. One time I decided to do this solo backpacking trip up along the Alaskan coast. I'm flying out there in a small little bush plane, and the pilot taking me there, he's like, in my 15 years of flying here, I've never heard of anyone wanting to do what you're doing. Are you sure you want to do this? I'm like, yeah, it sounds like a perfectly good idea to me. And, I had like my little portable electric fence and everything I was going to need, for camping in the wild around all these bears. And so where we landed, there's a couple lodges there, and they do a lot of guided bear viewing and photography from those lodges. And so when I was around that lodge, yeah, the bears were used to seeing people. They didn't mind seeing people. They allowed you to get lots of photographs with them. But as soon as I got, within a couple miles away from the lodge, all the bears I would see were like so scared of seeing me because they hadn't seen people in those areas before. They would see me and they would go hightailing out of there, and it was super hard to get any shots. By the time I got to the other end, where I was going to get picked back up by the bush plane, was also a spot where a lot of photographers and groups come to photograph bears, so they're used to seeing people. And again, it was so much easier to get the photographs because of the location. And so, in that case, knowing where to go can really matter. And so doing your research ahead of time is critical. The other thing that's critical is knowing the timing. You have to go at the right time of year to be able to capture either the behavior you want or to have the species that you want be accessible. And if I think about uh, uh, photography, telling a story is vitally important. And you have to think about, what is the story I'm trying to tell through my photography? And, do I want to capture fall colors? Am I trying to capture the bears pulling a fish out of the stream? Do I want moose and rudd? Am I after spring cubs? Do I want eagles interacting with each other? Or do I want owls tending to the young in their nest? What is the story and the dimension I'm trying to reveal here? And so, you have to, if you don't know that ahead of time, you need to start consulting wildlife experts and consult online forums. There's all kinds of forums out there where people are giving information on, okay, well, this is what we're starting to see here. This is a good time to go, so on and so forth. And then the last thing I'll throw out there is go with a knowledgeable guide. Having a local guide that knows the area, knows the animals, and knows their behavior will pay off with huge dividends in the kind of opportunities you get to capture. And then with location, you also have to learn about the animal's behavior. Because if you don't understand what their behavior is, it's going to be much harder to be able to predict what they're going to do in order to set yourself up for the right kind of shots.
Right. Okay. So online forums are a good way, reading generally about the animal behavior. I know
Uh-huh.
for the birds, I just put up, well, I didn't do this intentionally for photographing, but I put a bird feeder in front of my window, and I've learned a lot about bird behavior just from having a bird feeder.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, the more you observe them and watch them and learn about them, the easier your job is going to be as a photographer.
I always hire a local guide when I go somewhere. I'm not going to say always, but almost always. If my intention is to get good photographs, I for sure hire a local guide, and I've gotten some wonderful relationships out of it just from that.
Mhm.
I do joint photo tours now to Tuscany with the guy I ended up hiring to help me. How do I know what's this vast farmland? Tuscany is huge. How do I know
Oh
where to
yeah.
go?
Oh, I know. And it would take you so many visits to kind of figure out those best places, the best time of day to be there. And
And you can buy
and
a
most of us don't have that kind of time.
yeah, a guidebook is better than nothing.
Hmm.
I have a guidebook for this area, but when we did a photo tour in Tuscany in September last year, and there were a few mornings that we would drive to the spot and he wouldn't even stop. He just kept going and said, I'm going to go somewhere else. Light's not right. You know,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
and so we had all these ideas on where to go. And
Yeah.
it's the same thing we do with the Everglades. We're the big Everglades tour company here because we know where to go. In fact, some of the
Yeah.
guys, the big name guys, we actually put together their tours for them because how
Hmm.
do they know where to go? They live in Massachusetts, you know?
Exactly. And that's kind of the value that, Action Photo Tours brings to people in the Southwest is, there's a lot of very difficult to find places down there, difficult to get into. And there's a ton of local knowledge that you need, in order to know when the light is right, what time of year to go, where, and being able to offer that value to our clientele can really makes a ton of difference to them, especially when they want to do things that are more technical in nature, such as like storm and monsoon photography or night photography.
Um, yeah, and also it's safer to go with other people. You shouldn't be out, like you should never be out in the Everglades all by yourself.
Oh yeah, that's
And
very true
not
too.
because of alligators and snakes, but because there's limestone and it is so easy to break your ankle. I mean,
Oh
people
yeah.
break their ankles. That's what happens in the Everglades.
Hmm.
So having
And
someone with you is always a good idea.
oh, for sure. And like
All right,
out in the
so
Southwest, if you get stuck in the sand or you're out in these areas where there's no cell signal, it can be a dangerous situation.
yeah, there's no cell signal in the Everglades. So
Oh
yeah, I
yeah.
would never go out there by myself. And I go out a lot, but I would never go by myself. All right, so let's keep talking about locations. So a lot of research ahead of time. What about and you said about the animal behavior. Um, what else about location that I should know? I mean, the right vantage point to be, okay, so let's say, I know that there is going to be the caribou or whatever you said in this area. How do
Hmm.
you know where to stand or where to put your gear or where to?
Yeah, and so part of that's knowing the animal's behavior and kind of predicting ahead of time what they're going to do. But then the other part of it that comes into play is the standard photography principles and composition. And so, in order to make things happen, you have to um, have a bit of luck. And by luck, I mean you got to be out in the field enough that everything comes together the right way. So you got to be there at the right time of the day. You've got to have good lighting. You have to be willing to return multiple times. You can't just show up once and expect to get the money shot. You got to have the right direction of the light. You've got to have the right animal pose and behavior. So, it's not easy. And if it was easy, then everyone would have amazing shots and you wouldn't feel that wonderful elation after you do capture a money shot, you know. So you do have to work for it. But then you have to be ready at a moment's notice. One time I had a client and yeah, his day job was that he photographed celebrities in Los Angeles. And we were just out, taking a look at some of the mountain views up there in Alaska, just kind of chilling a little bit. And all of a sudden, this pack of wolves runs across the road up in front of us. And I looked around and I said, "Oh, wolves!" And it was like one fluid motion. This guy had his camera in hand. He had turned around and he was nailing shots before any of us even thought to even grab our cameras. And afterwards, I told him, "Wow, that was incredible. How are you so fast?" And again, it's because he's used to photographing celebrities, and if he's not there in that split-second moment, he'll miss his opportunity. And so for me, that was amazing to see that kind of fluidity and that being able to be that quick with it. But another time, I was with some clients out at White Pocket, which is these really cool rock formations in northern Arizona. And we had this flaming sunset going on. We're taking all these landscape shots. And I heard this noise behind me, and I turned around, and this free-range cow had actually wandered into the scene. And so I told my clients, "Hey, there's a cow right behind us, and he's standing in like the perfect spot." And so we hurried and turned around, and we got shots with this cow on the sandstone with this amazing sunset going on behind us. And so, just being able to be ready and adaptable, to whatever happens will really pay off. Another time I was in the Canadian Rockies and I backpacked into these remote lakes. And during this trip, I'd really hoped I'd see some bears and also some caribou, but I hadn't seen anything for a couple days. And I was out there getting ready to set up a sunrise shot, and I hear a noise, and I look over to my right, and I see this caribou walking over, starting to munch on some grass. The fall colors were like really nice. And so I was like, "Oh, hi." And so I just turned my camera a little bit, got him into the right composition, up my ISO quite a bit so that I wouldn't blur out the caribou with the motion, and took the shot. And so just being able to be ready and adaptable is what it's going to take.
Now, do you shoot in an auto mode or a
I'm really Yeah, I like to shoot in aperture priority mode because controlling the depth of field for me is vitally important. If I'm trying to show an animal in context of a landscape, then I'm going to need a lot more depth of field than will a wildlife photographer seeking only to show an animal portrait. In that case, a wildlife photographer is going to go after the more shallow depth of field because they want to kind of blur out what's behind the animal because all they want to show is the animal's portrait. Now, for me, it's different. I want to be able to see those nice mountains behind. I want to see the creek running through the scene. And I want the animal to complement the landscape, which means I need higher depth of field, anywhere from, depending on the light levels, anywhere from f6.3 to f8. Or if there is enough light, I could go as high as f11, f13.
Okay.
And so, when I'm shooting in aperture priority mode, the thing that you really have to pay attention to is what is the shutter speed that I'm getting as I meter the scene. And in order to arrest motion, you have to have a fast enough shutter speed so that, if the animal does move, you're not going to blur out that motion. And depending on how fast the animal's moving is going to depend on how fast of a shutter speed you need. But generally speaking, it's going to be anywhere from about 1/50th of a second up to about 1/500th of a second. Unless you're shooting things like birds in flight or anything that's really fast, in that case, you need to be well over 1/1000th of a second. But that's not the type of photography we're kind of talking about here.
So do you use your ISO in auto so that your shutter speed doesn't get too slow?
Yeah, and so auto ISO, especially on these newer cameras, is extremely useful. Like on the Sony, for example, I can configure my auto ISO to give me a specific minimum shutter speed. I can say, okay, auto ISO, you're going to give me at least 1/500th of a second on every shot. And then I can just forget about it and not worry because now obviously if it's real dark out, then I'm not going to want to do that because it's going to be, there's too little light. I don't want to be shooting at ISO 12,800, for example.
Right.
And so you also have to be considerate to that and kind of ask yourself, well, what's the highest ISO I'm willing to be able to tolerate for this type of shot? And you just have to know your camera for that. Some cameras can shoot very high ISO with quite clean results. Other cameras are going to be very grainy and have a difficult time removing that grain and noise in post.
Yes, the newer cameras, I mean, are amazing. So let's talk about composition. How do you position how much of the wildlife do you put into the composition, or does it depend? And what does it depend on?
Totally depends. Yeah. One of my one experience I remember that when I first started getting into photography was I went over to Yellowstone in the fall. And, I got up early one morning and I had full intention on capturing these shots of the full moon as it was setting right at sunrise. And it was a beautiful morning. We had frost on the ground and there was fog banks moving in and out. But then behind me, I heard some elk bugling. And so I turned around and I see this bull elk with a harem of about 10 cows on the ridges back behind. And, this was opposite basically shooting into the light where the sun was coming up. So everything was kind of silhouetted and had that warm glow with the fog. I was like, oh man, that's an amazing looking shot. So I abandoned my plans to photograph the full moon. And I started hiking up over the ridges to get a little closer to where the elk were. And then I got into that spot, where I had the elk positioned right where I wanted him. And I waited and he lifted up his head and I fired off a bunch of rapid fire shots. And, I wasn't zoomed in that far. I was like maybe only 200 millimeter because I wanted the elk to be small relative to the surrounding landscape. And by doing so, it made the landscape look huge because now I have this bull elk down in the lower third or lower left third of the frame. And he's lifting up his head. He's got his antlers up and we've got swirling fog and warm light everywhere. It was a really cool experience. Wow. Now, obviously, if I had more of the wildlife focus, I would have zoomed all the way in on this elk and just gotten more of a tight portrait. But instead, the shot I liked so much more showed the elk in the grander context of the landscape.
Yeah, well, it sounds like the lighting would have been bad for a portrait anyway.
It actually could have been really cool too, because it was cold enough. When you'd breathe out, you'd see the frosted air coming out of his mouth and everything. And you can still see that from further away too, but it's just not the prominent or the salient part of the composition. Okay. Now, the main thing that you have to keep in mind when you're composing is that animals need space in front of them in order to move or to look into the frame.
Okay.
And so if we're thinking rule of thirds here, generally speaking, I will put the animal on either the left third of the frame or the right third of the frame and position them vertically too, thinking about rule of thirds. And then I will give 2/3 of that space in front of either where the animal is looking or in front of where the animal is moving. Because you don't want it to appear as if the animal is kind of moving out of your frame or looking out of your frame, because that allows the viewer's eye to try to also travel out of the frame. As photographers, we need to keep the viewer's eyes engaged within the photo. We don't want it traveling outside the photo or focusing on extraneous elements that are not part of our compositional intent. And so that's the first thing. And you also have to think about balance in your photo. So if I have like an elk on one side, well, generally I need to balance it with something else on the other side, whether that be like the sun behind and light coming in, or a nice tree there, or a mountain. It needs to have something to kind of help balance it out. And so you don't want to have all the weight on just one side of the image. You need to have, it needs to be complementary.
Okay.
And then as far as the other thing I look for with composition is, what is the light doing? And photography is all about light. And if you just don't have light, it's hard to get a really good photo. And so, if you see a spot where the sun is shining and you think, okay, well, maybe if I can get the animal to move up that way, then I'll try to arrange my composition so that I'm ready in case that ends up happening. And then if I can get the light on the animal, it makes all the difference on the shot. And then avoid messy things. There's a lot of stuff that's going to make your composition look messy. And you have to consciously ask yourself, is having this in my shot, is it adding to the composition or is it subtracting from the composition? And so oftentimes by just moving a few feet, either to the right or to the left, you can avoid a lot of things that make things very messy, whether it be grass sticking up or some tree branches coming in. I can name any number of things. The other thing that I always tell people about is look at the horizon and pay attention to your height when you're shooting relative to that horizon. Sometimes if I walk up the hill just a few feet, it can make all the difference in the shot, or if I walk down the hill a few feet, it can also really improve things. One time I was shooting a subject off in the distance, and they were kind of juxtaposed against this dark mountain. Well, I couldn't really see this dark subject against this dark mountain, but there's a fog band just below that. And so, since I was paying attention to what I was seeing in the camera, I then walked up the hill maybe 10 feet, and that slight change in perspective put my subject now within the bright fog band instead of against the dark mountain, and that made all the difference.
Ah, good.
Or if you think about it, in terms of the sky, if I have an elk that's totally up into silhouetted up into the sky, that may look a lot better than if the horizon cuts just halfway through the animal. And so that's the thing that you most want to avoid usually, is just having a horizon cut right in between your subject. Either you want them surrounded all by landscape, or you want them as much up into the sky as you can get.
Okay, that's good. That's good stuff. And you brought up another good point too, that you don't want the animal to blend into the background. You need some contrast there.
Yeah, you definitely need the contrast, especially if you have a dark subject against a dark background, or the other way around, if you have a very light subject against a light background, it's going to generally look better against a darker background. And there's many things that we can do as photographers to control that. We can move around, we can walk up or down the hill, we can kind of anticipate behavior. Oh, they might move over this way, so I'm going to get set up here just so I'm ready.
I always carry, I live in Florida. We don't have hills.
That's true.
We do have landfills. Those are our hills. So I always carry one of those little, I don't even know what they're called, but you get them at like Home Goods or even Walmart, I guess. They're just little plastic stools that fold up and have a handle. Do you know what I'm talking about? They're very common.
I think, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I have several different sizes of those, and I carry them with me because they're lightweight, and I can actually stick it on my backpack. And sometimes I want to get up higher, and I'm 5'2", so
Yeah.
I can't get up that high.
And
Now, the one thing that I tell people, especially bird photographers, we have a lot of beautiful shorebirds here.
mm-hmm.
I'm like, do your yoga, because you got to get down really, really low. And I can I straddle my legs and I lean on my elbows when I'm taking pictures often, because I can.
Yeah.
And it's helpful as a photographer. So.
Oh, it totally is. And there's so many things you can do outside the box too if you can't quite get to where you need to. Like, I have a really tall tripod, and I've been known to extend that tripod as high as it'll go, and then pick up the bottom part of the legs, hold it way up above my head, and then have the camera fire off a 10-second timer. And so,
screen?
What was that?
Do you have a flip screen on that camera so you can see?
Oh yeah, and flip screens help so much. And then you can see what you're actually shooting before it goes off, and yeah. But one of the things too is when you're in the field, you just always be asking yourself, how can I improve this shot? And what I see people doing so often is they'll just set up in one spot, they'll just keep shooting the same shot over and over again, and it may not be the best shot that they can take. And so always ask yourself, well, what can I do? Should I move around, experiment, try a different position, try going to the left, try going to the right, go really low like you talk about, or maybe you need to get up much higher to kind of push down the horizon, whatever you need to do, just give it a go. This is a digital world. We're not shooting film here where it's costing us money for every shot that we take. So
Just time, time to
yes,
process.
just time and hard drive space.
Yeah, I totally agree though, and that is such a great exercise. If you force yourself, for me, it's usually when I force myself to be bored. I'm not forcing myself usually. I am bored. I'm like stuck somewhere, and so I force myself to take as many pictures, unique pictures as I can. But that's a
Mhm.
great. I like your question. How can I improve this shot? What can I do to improve this shot? What angle
Yep.
can? Yeah, just always have a question in your mind like that. That's great. All right,
And
so
I
let's
know,
talk. Oh, go
oh,
ahead.
and I know a lot of people don't don't like chimping. Yeah, that's basically where you're kind of looking at your shots while you're taking them. But I find that chimping helps me a lot more in the field than not chimping. Because when I chimp and I look at that shot and say, okay, what is it that doesn't work here? Then all of a sudden I realize how I need to improve the next shot I take. Now, obviously, there's times not to do it, like if you have a critical uh, thing that's going on where like the lion is nursing the cub and oh you have to capture that and you can't miss any moments. Yeah, then that's not the time to chimp. But you have a moment where nothing's happening and there's kind of a lull in the action. Take advantage of that. Figure
Yeah.
out what you did right and what you need to do better so that if another opportunity presents itself, you're ready to go.
Boy, I'm in 100% agreement with you. All right, now, so we talked about camera settings a lot, but you said something in the beginning that I wanted to bring up again, and now I forgot what it was, so I'm gonna put my glasses on, but it was something about camera settings. So start talking about camera settings. Now, you said that you're in aperture priority most of the time.
hmm And the reason I like aperture priority is because it accounts for rapidly changing situations in light. I'm letting the camera do the metering for me rather than trying to um, constantly adjust on my own for the metering if I was shooting in a more like manual mode, for example.
Okay.
And anything I can do to speed up the process, I'm a fan of. And so if aperture priority mode is going to help me take faster photos, I'm all for using that. Now there are times to use manual, but I would say I use manual less than 10% of my less than 10% of the time because it's so much slower for me. And for me, I like just having that exposure compensation right at my disposal. So I can, if I need a brighter shot, I just quickly adjust exposure compensation higher. If I need it darker, I just expose the compensation lower. And again, I'm paying attention to the important things that I need to expose for. Let's say I'm shooting into the light and I've got rim lighting around my animal. Well, I definitely don't want to be blowing out those nice highlights in that rim light. And so in that case, I will probably expose a little lower to ensure that I'm not going to blow out those highlights.
I I I have actually pretty strong feelings about what you just said.
Uh-huh.
Here's my thought. My thought is that if you're just learning photography, you should be shooting in the manual mode until you really, really understand it. And then any mode goes. Because the thing is, in aperture priority especially, a lot of people are getting blurry pictures because they don't understand the relationship of what's happening in there and their shutter speed is going too slow. Now,
Yeah.
most of the cameras don't do what yours does, where you can say, oh, don't go under whatever shutter speed. So it's up to them to pay attention, and they don't pay attention because the camera
hmm
is doing so much thinking for them. So for
Yeah.
me, with the beginners, I tell them to start an ISO auto and
hmm
have control over the shutter speed and the um, aperture, just
hmm
until they really, really get it,
Yeah.
because they unfortunately just don't pay attention when they don't fully understand it.
Yeah, and
So
that's a really good point. If you When you're starting out and practicing, yeah, manual mode is a great tool for uh, understanding the interaction between, well, how does changing the shutter speed affect the exposure? How does changing the aperture affect the exposure? How do they interrelate? What does one stop difference mean here? What does plus two stops difference mean with this variable? And it's really getting that exposure triangle under your belt, the relationship between ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Now, obviously, for those of us who've been shooting for a while, it's just, it's easy. We understand, okay, if I need to double my shutter speed, I can just raise my ISO by one stop. And all of a sudden now I've got twice as fast of a shutter speed. But for a beginner, that's a concept that's not as easy to get. And you're absolutely right. If people aren't thinking about it, then they're going to get that blurry shot because they're shooting at their base ISO in aperture priority mode, and they don't realize that they should have used a tripod or increased their ISO.
Right. Yeah. So I do. And I shoot an aperture. Well, I shouldn't say that. I very rarely shoot an aperture priority. Usually I'll go to shutter priority if I'm going to shoot in an auto mode. But whenever they came out with auto ISO, man, I was in heaven.
Yeah.
But the newer cameras like yours are so good because you can set the limits. Even with the ISO, you can set a limit, I would imagine.
Oh yeah, you can say don't go over this, and then this is the minimum shutter speed I need, and
Yeah, that's awesome. So, all right, so do a little summary now. So why should we do this? Why shouldn't we just do portraits of animals?
Well, it's not that you shouldn't do portraits of animals, because it's certainly a great thing to do. And I like both types of photography, but for me, my most favorite wildlife shots have always been where I show the animal in context of the grander landscape. Because for me, it's about connecting the wildlife to the landscape. And I like both types of photography. And so for me, that's the best of both worlds if I can get that type of shot. And so to kind of summarize, the reason why I kind of brought this topic up is because most of the people listening to this podcast are probably landscape photographers. And we still utilize the same principles of landscape photography here, but now we're trying to include some wildlife in the scene. And so much of the same gear that you already have can be used for this purpose. You probably are going to have like a 100 to 400 millimeter lens that's hand holdable in your camera bag. Well, when you go out, just make sure it's in the bag, because you never know when that opportunity may present itself. And then with the newer cameras, of course, we have so much improvement in better ISO capability, faster frame rates, faster cards and buffering speeds. And so once again, the same camera and gear that you're using for your landscape setup can also work for including some wildlife. And so, having the right gear is obviously important, but it's not the end all. You can have inferior gear as you start out and then gradually upgrade as you get more and more into it. But then as we talked about, the location becomes huge. You have to know where to go to be able to find animals that are going to allow you to photograph them. If you go to these really remote regions, you may really struggle trying to get the shot unless you're willing to set up a blind and sit in there for hours on end. And for me, that's just not the type of photographer I am. I would get so impatient sitting in a blind that I would just give up and go home. I like to be a very active photographer. I like to be hiking around, looking at stuff. And when there's no wildlife, then I'm shooting landscapes or looking for compositions for when the light is right for shooting the landscapes. And as far as location goes, having a guide or consulting online forums or doing your research ahead of time will pay off huge in the end results that you get. And then finally, you have to pay attention to your camera settings and your composition. We talked about various tips for how to get the right kind of composition, but you also have to make sure you are well versed on using your camera, being able to change settings quickly and on the fly, and being able to move around quickly as well, and being able to take pictures on a moment's notice is going to help you immensely.
that was good. Good stuff.
Oh, well, thank you, Peggy.
You know, I like you because you can tell you're a teacher. So you break things down, explain things really clearly. And that to me is very helpful. And I think that's what our audience likes.
Oh, yes. And if anyone is interested in, what we have to offer, I invite you to visit my website at actionphototours.com. We offer tours and workshops primarily in the Southwest United States, but we also have branched out to some other areas as well, including Iceland, Greenland, Pacific Northwest, and so forth. And then I'm also part of the Outsiders Photography Group. There's 4 of us photographers, and we're putting together these amazing conferences and events for nature photographers. And our next one is coming up in October in Telluride, Colorado, right during the peak fall colors. And we've got National Geographic's Paul Nicklin coming as our keynote speaker. And if any of you have seen his wildlife photos, they are just absolutely stunning. He is like seriously one of my idols out there in the field. And, if I could take pictures half as good as his, I would be a happy man. So
Awesome.
yeah, I invite people to take a look at those things that we have on offer, and that's outsidersphoto.com.
Outsidersphoto.com, and your other website is?
actionphototours.com.
actionphototours.com. David Swindler, thank you so much for being on the Understand Photography show.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to be able to speak with you today.
Wow, I got a lot out of that show. I think David's a really good teacher. I think that's good. That's what we want on the Understand Photography show. If you could do us a favor and leave us a review on iTunes, or I think it's called Apple Podcasts now, we really appreciate it. It's so helpful to us. It helps us come up in the search engines for podcasts. I'm Peggy Farron. Thanks so much for joining us on the Understand Photography show. We will talk to you next week.